Right, so today it's classic research for component 1, psychology, Eduqas by the way. So if you haven't watched my previous video, this is Eduqas. It might link and apply to AQA because none of the information here is necessarily wrong, but obviously the specs are different, so make sure you're on Eduqas if you're, or if you just want to watch this as a hobby and you don't take psychology, then feel free as well. Right, so biological classic research, Raine, Buschbaum and Lecasse for AO1. The methodology, Raine et al. Conducted a quasi-difference experiment. The independent variable was whether they pleaded not guilty by reason of insanity, which I'll abbreviate to NGRI, to murder or manslaughter. The dependent variable was glucose metabolism in regions of the brain. So this just refers to brain region activity. They used a glucose tracker in order to track, essentially, hence the name, brain region activity. So they used opportunity sampling to sample 82 participants, which they split into two groups using a matched pairs experimental design. So it was 41 participants and 41 participants. So the NGRI group were 32 men and 2 women with a mean age of 34.3 years old with a history of brain injury or brain damage. There were 6 schizophrenics, multiple other mental illnesses and potential environmental triggers. I believe if you have the psychology book for component 1, it will go into detail of the exact numbers of the mental illnesses. So I'll drop that in the comments below if I can find it. So the control group weren't criminals. There were 6 schizophrenics matched though out of a large psychiatric sample. The control group, however, had a mean age of 31.3, but they did have 32 men and 2 women. They were matched according to sex and age of the force group. So even though they were matched, obviously there's some discrepancies there which you can go into for your AO3. So the procedures for Raine et al. Both groups were given the opportunity to practice the continuous performing task, so the CPT, 10 minutes before the allocated start time. They were tasked with either clicking 1 or 2, depending on visual and audio cues. They were instructed to only press the mouse when they heard or saw a 1. This was to elicit brain activity in regions associated with impulse and response control. So afterwards, they were injected with a radioactive glucose tracer, so fluorodeoxyglucose, 30 seconds after they started the actual CPT to prevent a task novelty effect. So if you can't remember the name fluorodeoxyglucose, you don't really have to include it. All you have to say is radioactive glucose tracer. But I guess, I don't know, for my exams I memorized it because it's an interesting name, and I figured I might get some brownie points just to make yourself sound more confident in your answer, if you know what I'm saying. So they underwent the CPT for 32 minutes before being transferred to a PET scanning room. The PET performed 10 scans using cortical peel and box techniques to achieve the desired images. So the findings of the experiment. So Raine et al. What I would do is, don't type Raine et al. Because the study is Raine, Buschbaum and Lecasse. However, in brackets you can say Raine et al. To refer back to it, because obviously saying Raine, Buschbaum and Lecasse in your exam constantly every single time, it can waste time. But because Raine has done other studies under the name Raine et al., you have to be able to make that distinction that you're referring to this one in particular. So Raine et al. Found that the parietal lobe, prefrontal cortex and the corpus callosum had lower glucose levels than the control group. The cingulate and temporal lobe were found to have no difference in glucose metabolic rates. The thalamus and medial temporal lobe, including the hippocampus, were found to have lower left glucose metabolisms but greater right glucose metabolism. So to help you remember this one, obviously lower left, LL, and greater right, GR. And so LL is easy to remember, but if you just remember greater as GR, then it will trigger your memory to remember greater right. So the occipital lobe had higher glucose metabolic rates than the control group. The caudate, putamen, globus pallidus, midbrain and cerebellum had slightly lower levels of glucose metabolism, but no significant differences were found. So extra findings. So there was no difference in CPT performance. 6 NGRIs who were left-handed showed lesser amygdala asymmetry. So they had greater symmetry between the left and right amygdala, and they found that they had heightened prefrontal cortex activity. 23 NGRIs with a history of head injury, I need to fix that typo, had no significant difference between slightly lower corpus callosum activity. 14 NGRIs were non-white and showed no significant difference. So conclusions to the experiment. There are statistically significant differences in brain glucose metabolism between NGRIs and controls. However, this does not mean that NGRIs do not have responsibility for their actions. Findings are not conclusive and may be one of many predispositions to violence. Further research must be conducted. This does not suggest that violence is determined by biology alone. For example, social factors can also come into play. As a result, generalizations cannot be made to other violent offenders or other types of crimes. You will elaborate this in your AO3. So AO3 for Raine. So evaluating the methodology, an advantage of using PET scans and a glucose tracker, fluorodeoxyglucose, is that it is an objective standard of measure. Therefore, we can more strongly establish a causal relationship between the IV and the DV. So instead of using things like interviews, etc., which are they are bound to be affected by confounding / extraneous variables, using a glucose tracker and a PET scan, it's an objective standard of measure. It's objective. You cannot oppose it, especially because of the precautions they used beforehand. So the participants were withdrawn from their medication for 2 weeks because the medication likely affected their brain chemistry, such their brain function. So because it is a laboratory experiment, there is high internal validity. This is because the researchers will be able to control any confounding or extraneous variables that may arise, because they are able to easily manipulate experimental conditions. The combination of it being a laboratory experiment and the use of PET scans also increases the reliability of the study, as it allows other psychologists to repeat the experiment. Despite this, the activity used to elicit brain activity, so the CPT, may not be an internally valid method of stimulating brain activity to perfectly mimic impulse control. This is because the difference between completing a CPT and killing somebody is astronomically large and may activate other brain regions that a CPT would not. Therefore, it is not mundanely realistic. So, what essentially I'm saying here is obviously completing a CPT and killing somebody are far on the scale of impulse control and how you would necessarily measure it. They are so far apart that it may actually harm the internal validity of the experiment. While obviously, to make it perfectly mundanely realistic, you would have to get somebody to kill somebody or something, which is ethically absolute. It would be denied by the ethics board, of course it would. But nevertheless, it's a valid point to make for evaluation. So, as acknowledged by Raine, the sample consists of a very specific type of people, those pleading NGRI, so not guilty by reason of insanity. Whenever you use an abbreviation / initialism, technically, you should put the full length of the phrase in brackets, or preferably put the full length of the phrase first and then put the abbreviation / initialism in brackets. This means that the study is not entirely externally valid. The sample cannot be generalized to not only the rest of the criminal / homicidally criminal population, but also the rest of the population. Because of the study being a quasi-experiment, Raine is not fully able to manipulate the independent variable. This means that there is a lack of researcher control of the experiment. Therefore, causal conclusions are not necessarily justified, as acknowledged in the conclusions of the experiment. For a causal relationship to be established, every single possible variable would have to be controlled by Raine. And while there is a high level of control because it's a laboratory experiment using PET scans and the CPT, etc., obviously Raine cannot necessarily manipulate the DV or the IV necessarily. There's a lack of research control, so it's susceptible to other potential variables. And there's other things as well. So them taking consistent medication over time may have permanently affected their brain chemistry, or it may have permanently affected how their brain functions. So actually the results of the PET scans may have been flawed from the start. So perhaps if you were to compare their neurological glucose metabolism before or at the time of committing the crime / before, compared to afterwards when they were on medication and during that 2-week period, there may be a difference in function. Things like that. The use of a matched pairs design is advantageous as it reduces the effects of individual differences between participants. The use of a matched control group sets a baseline for similarly psychologically affected individuals that Raine et al. Can compare the scans of the NGRIs with. This is an advantage as it increases the internal validity of the experiment. It ensures that they are truly measuring what is intended to measure. So if there was no control group, they would have nobody to measure it against. But because they matched it with them, they use similarly psychologically disturbed or neurologically inhibited individuals to match them with, such as the 6 schizophrenics. They are able to measure between what is closest to typically developing and typically functioning to the NGRI group, so they are able to tell the differences. Because if they were to get for example, the average population without schizophrenia, without epilepsy, for instance, then the differences between them might have been caused by the schizophrenia, or it might have been caused by the epilepsy. Those would have acted as confounding variables. So by matching it, it increased the internal validity of the experiment. So ethical issues. There is an apparent lack of informed consent. This is because the participants were not completely operating free from coercion. This is because there were many schizophrenic, epileptic, and other participants with mental illnesses, some with brain injury that partook. Not only this, but they were not administered any medication for 2 weeks prior to the experiment. This means that they may have not been in the right frame of mind to consent. Furthermore, they were all goaded to consent with the glimmer of hope that it would alleviate their sentence, which Raine's conclusions drastically let down. Otherwise, they would be convicted of murder of manslaughter outright, rather than being found not guilty by reason of insanity. Some participants may view having a brain scan as intrusive, therefore their right to privacy could be arguably violated. Despite these ethical issues, there are some advantages. There is a respect for the participants' right to confidentiality. Their names, places of residency, etc. were not released or leaked. They also may not have understood their right to withdraw at any time, given their status as prisoners. However, you could argue that while it was there, however, again, unless if it was explicitly stated that they could leave at any time, then their right to withdraw arguably wasn't necessarily respected, but also their status as prisoners and the risk that if they left, then they would face harsher sentences. They entrench too far into the realms of coercion that their right to withdraw doesn't necessarily exist. So social implications. The use of a PET scan may run the risk of implying that there is a causal relationship established, which may lead a layperson, so an ordinary person, to believe that there is a cause and effect relationship between these brain regions. So the issue is that because these results are published publicly, things like the media, social media, the newspapers, they may, in their own agendas, they may twist some words, and the average person is not going to look at the original article to understand that, okay, there is not a direct causal relationship. So this is a negative social implication, as it may run the risk of predisposing individuals to unfair treatment based on the structure of their brains, so this stigma. So this may result in societal stigma against these people, which is not only ableist, but may predispose them to psychological or physical harm. The labelling of a psychopath brain would be detrimental to both society and the criminal justice system, as it may skew jural decisions due to bias against people with this particular brain structure. This may open the gates to further injustice. However, the establishing of a neurological archetype that is predisposed to criminally violent behaviour may allow institutions to implement preventative measures. For instance, if this brain composition is found in a child, parents/carers/teachers may be able to implement/encourage enrichments or an increased number of positive experiences to prevent the manifestation of criminal behaviour. Such is demonstrated in the differences in behaviour of the criminals in Raine et al.'s study versus the behaviour of psychologist James Fallon. Upon receiving a brain scan, he found out that he had all the neurological and genetic characteristics and capabilities to elicit violent criminal behaviour. However, he suggested that his increased positive experiences as a child did not allow him to develop such behaviours. Undoubtedly, a positive social implication is the advancement that this has made in therapy. Biological therapies follow the philosophy of the medical model, suggesting that psychological pathology, so psychological illness, has a physiological, technically neurological cause. This study reinforces that perspective. This study may have led to the advancement and further use of psychosurgery, such as the contemporary transcranial magnetic stimulation, bilateral cingulotomy, and deep brain stimulation. This is because this study demonstrates that those with abnormal psychological function do have physiological abnormalities compared to the typically functioning individual, even if psychologically disturbed, demonstrated by the control group. So AO1 for Bowlby's 44 Thieves. The methodology was opportunity sampling with a matched pairs experimental design. There were two groups of 88 children separated between thieves and non-thieves being the control group, with a sample of mothers to assess the case history of the children. The independent variable was whether they had stolen or not, making it a quasi-difference experiment. Study is more accurate. Study is far more accurate. The dependent variable was the provisional diagnosis, assumably, as to whether they had affection or psychopathy. The group consisting of thieves, however, consisted of 31 boys and 13 girls, where stealing was either a serious or transitory problem. Over half had not been convicted due to their age, half were over 11. They were referred to the Child Guidance Clinic in London. Half the cases were serious and chronic theft, so grade 4. 10 were persistent but mild thieving, grade 3. A few had mild, low numbers of cases of theft, so grade 2, and only one had stolen once, being grade 1. IQ scores. So 50% had an IQs of 85 to 114, 15 with a higher IQ, and 2 with an IQ below 85. The control group were from the same clinic but had not stolen and were matched with the thieving group based on economic circumstances, intelligence, age, and sex. So the procedures. This was conducted at the London Child Guidance Clinic during the years 1936 to 39 using opportunity sampling. Children were given mental tests to test intelligence, but their emotional attitude towards it was noted by the psychiatrist. Meanwhile, a social worker collocated a preliminary psychiatric history of the patient. At the end of the hour, reports were made by both psychologist and social worker, and this was reported to the psychiatrist who interviewed the mother. A 2-hour examination given by the psychiatrist followed to the mother and child. Afterwards, a case conference was held where information and impressions were pooled with school and other reports to form a provisional diagnosis. In most cases, psychotherapy was given to the children, whilst the mother talked out issues with a social worker. This usually lasted 6 months or over in most cases. Bowlby created 6 categories for the children. So 2 children were classed as normal, being children who were reasonably stable. 9 children were classed as depressed, being unstable children who now had a depressed state of mind. 2 children were diagnosed with being circular, so these were children who alternated between overactivity and depression. 13 children were described as hypothymic, so children who were always overactive. 14 children were described as affectionless, so these children were described as children characterized by being void of emotion, shame or guilt, so these were the affectionless psychopaths. 4 children were described as being schizoid, so children characterized by having symptoms of this disorder. Out of the 2 out of 44 thieves who were classed as normal, they did not lead normal lives at home. Many were unwanted, and their fathers boasted hostility towards them directly. They also expressed instability. 40% of thieves had experienced prolonged separation from their mothers, compared to 5% of the control group. Prolonged separation was defined as more than 6 months. Of the 14 affectionless characters, 12, so 86%, had expressed prolonged separation from their mothers in the first 5 years of their life, while mother-child separation accounted for 17 out of the 44 cases. It did not account for the remaining 27. However, they had hostile home environments which included openly hostile fathers and anxious and unstable mothers. 5 out of the 27 cases had fathers that were hostile and expressed that they were not wanted. Of the 23 grade 4 persistent thieves, 13 of them were dubbed affectionless psychopaths. Of the 19 who suffered prolonged separation, 12 of them were persistent thieves. That is a lot right there, so I would recommend just going back and kind of reading it through. If my voice is distracting, then I'll say mute the video and just read it over and over again until you understand. It took me a while. So for the findings, 12 out of the 14 affectionless characters had prolonged separation. So 3 examples of this are Betty I, who was placed in a foster home at age 7 months. When her parents split up, she moved from one foster home to another and then spent a year in a convent school before she returned home at the age of 5 years. At 18 months, he was hospitalized for a case of diphtheria or diphtheria. He stayed there for 9 months and was not visited by his parents. Kenneth W. So between the ages of 3 and 9 years, he was primarily cared for by his grandfather, who had no control over him. Such separations were very rare amongst the other types of thieves. There were 13 non-affectionless thieves, only 3 of whom had experienced separation. In the control group, only 2 out of the 44 had experienced prolonged separation. So conclusions for Bowlby. This study supports the general psychiatric notion that the early years of childhood development are crucial. However, juvenile crime is just as much of a social and economic issue as it is psychological. If all who were involved in the pediatric development of the child were brought to light with the effects of prolonged maternal separation, then a superior effort could have been made to avoid many cases of juvenile criminal activity. Bowlby also subscribed to the psychoanalytic, psychodynamic view that early experiences are of vital importance in later development. The experience he focused on was the relationship between mother and its child, and the delay and separation of such leading to the hindrance of the development of the superego. Just a side note, Bowlby elaborated that by mother, he's referring to figures that can replace the mother or figures that act as the mother as well. But the actual mother would be the ideal force in the development of the child. So, AO3 for Bowlby's 44 Thieves. The methodology. A disadvantage of the study is that a causal relationship cannot be established between prolonged maternal separation and affectionless psychopathy. Only a mere yet strong relationship can be established between the two, as it's correlational. This is because the variable was not manipulated, because it's a quasi-difference experiment, because it's a quasi-different study. Moreover, it was only 12 out of 14 affectionate psychopaths, 86%, who had suffered from prolonged maternal separation. And while 86% is a very high number, it is almost 90%. If it was truly a cause and effect and causal relationship between the two, then it would be a 99 to 100% ratio between the two. Therefore, a definitive cause and effect relationship cannot be established. Additionally, because the collected data is qualitative, there may be biased data. Although it was collected by a respected psychologist, Bowlby, it is the interpretation of only one person. This means that there is an apparent lack of internal reliability, as there is no retest reliability. Furthermore, all children in this study were emotionally disturbed. This means that the sample is unrepresentative of all children, as most children are not emotionally disturbed. Furthermore, all children come from different backgrounds, with a lot of children coming from violent and dysfunctional homes, which could act as a confounding variable for the dependent variable. So, the number of children with affectionate psychopathy may not necessarily be caused by maternal separation, but could also be caused by the violent, dysfunctional and abusive homes that they grew up in. So over time, the findings found that a lot of the children, their fathers expressed and boasted to them that they were not wanted. Over time, this may act as a numbing effect. So of course, a child may become affectionless if they are being told that regularly by their father. So ethical issues, confidentiality issues may arise, given the examples of Betty I. Confidentiality issues may arise given the examples given of, for example, Betty I. Bowlby gave the age ranges of the children, the location. The confidentiality issues may arise given the examples given of, for example, Betty I. Bowlby gave the age ranges of the children, the location, so the London Child Guidance Clinic, and the full first name and initial of the last name of the child. This is a disadvantage, as somebody with enough effort could locate Betty. This is an ethical concern as to confidentiality, considering that she was mentally disturbed. So she was a mentally disturbed child at the time, making her a vulnerable participant. This is the same for Kenneth W. and everybody else mentioned. Moreover, there may have been an ethical issue related to privacy. School reports and interviews with the mothers are all related to the aims of the study, so this is arguably justified for Bowlby to carry out. However, subjecting the children to IQ tests is removed from the primary aim of the study. This is because an IQ is unrelated as to the relationship between maternal separation and affectionate psychopathy. If Bowlby wanted to measure how IQ affected affectionate psychopathy, or the attainment of such, or the acquisition of such, then it would be justified. However, he is measuring the relationship between maternal separation in the critical years of the child and affectionate psychopathy. So this may have an ethical concern for privacy. So social implications. While a causal relationship between prolonged maternal separation and affectionate psychopathy was not established, a very strong correlational relationship was certainly established. Therefore, the importance of a maternal figure in a child's life and a functional home was emphasized by the findings and conclusions of Bowlby's research. This has likely contributed to the implementation of maternal/paternal leave and the emphasis on the legalities of child abuse. Functions such as flexible working and working from home will allow for more children to have parental involvement during their critical period. While this may temporarily hurt the business they are working for, this will, over time, develop more functional adults to join the workforce. This will aid the economy and is another social implication. It's an economic advantage. Furthermore, legal punishment for minors can be attributed to these factors, allowing for more productive sentencing from judges. All in all, there is a greater emphasis placed on parental or pseudo-parental intervention in the successful development of a child. So Watson and Raynor for classic research. The methodology was a controlled observation using opportunity sampling, and the sample was a singular child, singular infant more accurately, Dubbed with the pseudonym Little Albert, however, his real name is argued to be Douglas Merritt. He was 9 months old at emotional testing. So the IV was stimuli presented to Little Albert to elicit a fear reaction, such as seal fur, cotton wool, a dog, and a white rat. The dependent variable was whether or not he presented a fear reaction, and this had an independent measures experimental design, as it was only one participant. So the aims of the study were: could a previously neutral stimulus be conditioned to produce an emotional response? Number 2, can this fear be transferred to other objects or animals? Number 3, will this fear change over time? Number 4, how will this fear be removed if it does not already die out? So the procedures of the experiment, I will warn you now, the procedures of this experiment and the findings of this experiment will be the most frustrating piece of memorization you will ever go through. However, if you really take your time to memorize it early, then it will get a lot easier. Like, it genuinely will get a lot easier. But I cannot say that it is fun, unless if obviously you enjoy it. So Watson and Raine's 1920 study into emotional conditioned responses was captured on a motion picture camera and was in a well-lit dark room, but in a laboratory environment. It was a controlled observation. The sample consisted of a singular child dubbed Little Albert and started when he was 9 months old. Emotional testing took place when he was 9 months old and consisted of Watson and Raynor presenting various objects, such as a white rabbit, a dog, a monkey, and a burning newspaper to Little Albert. This was to test whether he would have any unusual/abnormal reaction to the objects. The first session took place when he was 11 months and 3 days old, which consisted of him being presented with a white rat. Once he reached for the rat, a suspended steel bar was struck, producing a loud noise. This was done to elicit a fear reaction from Little Albert. This was repeated once more, and there was no emotional testing conducted for a week in order to not completely disturb the child. Quoted by Watson. The second session took place when he was 11 months and 10 days old and was to test whether he had drawn the behavioural association between the white rat and the loud noise. The rat is presented without the bar and the rat is then placed nearer. Albert is given blocks to play with after a presentation with the rat. 3 joint presentations are then given. Then the rat is presented alone. There are 2 joint presentations given afterwards. Then the rat is presented alone once more. The session after that took place at 11 months and 15 days and was to test his stimulus generalization. So this is a concept to essentially explain or suggest that similarly looking stimuli that to the original stimuli that elicited the fear reaction, the original fear reaction, would cause the same reaction, so the same fear reaction, because they look similar. So he's generalizing the fear across stimuli. There were 5 alternate presentations given with a rat and the blocks, starting with the blocks. Then the rabbit is presented alone and then with the blocks. Then he is presented with a dog alone. Afterwards, he is presented with blocks, then a fur coat and wool. The session after took place when he was 11 months and 20 days old. Little Albert is presented with the blocks and then the rat alone and given a joint presentation with the rat and the bar. He is presented with the rat on 2 occasions, then the rabbit alone. He is presented with blocks. There is a change of location in order to freshen Little Albert's reaction to the stimuli. Little Albert is then presented with dogs and the bar interchangeably, then presented with the blocks. The final session took place at 11 months and 21 days old, where he was presented with objects such as Watson's hair, a rat, a rabbit, and a seal fur coat finally. However, no joint stimulations were given. After this, the mother withdrew Little Albert from the experiment after learning the true nature of the research. She was not aware that he would be subject to such fear. So, findings. At emotional testing at 9 months old, little Albert was found to show no unusual reaction to any of the objects presented to him: a monkey, a burning newspaper, cotton wool, hair, a white rat, and a rabbit. At 11 months and 3 days, Albert jumped and fell forward once the bar was struck once. When this was repeated, he jumped, fell forward, and began to whimper. At 11 months and 10 days, Albert had steady fixation on the rat. He tentatively reached out, the rat was placed nearer, and immediately withdrew his hand when it was nosed by the rat. He reached out with his forefinger, but withdrew it suddenly. He played with the blocks happily. Upon experiencing joint presentations, he became startled and fell over. When the rat was presented alone, he had a puckered face, whimpered, and withdrew his hand sharply. In the series of joint stimulations, Albert was startled, fell over, and started crying. At 11 months and 15 days, Albert reached out and played with the blocks that were presented. With the rat, he whimpered and withdrew his hand and physically tried to get away by turning around. With the rabbit, he leaned as far back as possible, whimpered, and cried. Watson and Raynor found that with the dog, Albert did not have as violent as a response compared to the rabbit, rat, or the joint stimulations. However, he shrank back and attempted to get away once it had barked. With the fur coat, he withdrew immediately and began to fret. He withdrew if it was placed closer. Albert kicked away the cotton wool and withdrew his hand from it, but he did not show the same shock that the animals or fur coat produced in him. At 11 months and 20 days, he played with the blocks. With the rat alone, he withdrew with his whole body and bent over. With the rat alone, he withdrew with his whole body and bent over, but there was no crying, only fixation on the rat and following with his eyes. There was a violent reaction to the joint presentation. The rabbit alone caused Albert to lean over to the left side as far as possible. He did not fall over, however, he began to whimper, but his reaction was not so violent on former occasions. He reached for the blocks readily. He additionally had pronounced reactions to the rat alone once the location was switched. It was most pronounced with joint presentations with the rat and the bar, spelling mistake. He played with the blocks. With the dog, he had no pronounced reaction until the dog barked. Further qualitative observations found that Albert used thumb sucking as a way of blocking fear and unpleasant stimuli. He would suck his thumb if he was on the verge of tears, but only did this when he was in a state of displeasure. So, conclusions for Watson and Raynor. Number 1. Could a previously neutral stimulus be conditioned to produce an emotional response? Not the slightest fear response was observed during the regular emotional testing prior to the test. It took 7 joint stimulations to elicit the complete reaction. Conclusively, a previously neutral stimulus can be conditioned to elicit a feared response. Number 2. Can this fear be transferred to other objects or animals? It took 5 days after the second session for this to transfer to a white rabbit, a dog, hair, cotton wool, and a fur coat. The range of transfers may be very large. Number 3. Will this fear change over time? An observation conducted a year later demonstrates that these fears do persist, albeit with much less intensity. This suggests that the fear will last indefinitely and will influence personality throughout life. Number 4. How will this fear be removed if it does not already die out? The opportunity to remove this fear was denied. Otherwise, attempts to quote-unquote recondition little Albert would have been performed through counter-conditioning, such as feeding him candy. This fear will last indefinitely unless accidentally removed by another stimulus. So AO3 for the methodology for Watson and Raynor. One issue with the methodology of the little Albert experiment is that there is an apparent lack of external validity. This is because the sample size is one 9-month-old infant. This sees unrepresentative of the general population and casts doubt on the generalizability of the conclusions of the observation. However, it is important to also acknowledge that for ethical reasons, this observation likely would be impossible to have been performed on more than one child. Moreover, it is a study to understand behavioural acquisition through classical conditioning. So little Albert, despite only being one participant, ensured that the observation had high internal validity because of his non-responsive nature to stimuli in the emotional testing prior to the actual controlled observation before any of the tests, in accordance with the blank slate approach. This, in addition to being so young, ensures that confounding variables such as trauma, which is likely to be present in an older participant, would not affect the findings. While the study was a controlled observation, it was conducted in a laboratory-like environment. This is advantageous as it allows for Watson and Raynor to have greater control over extraneous variables that could have affected the dependent variable. Watson and Raynor's observation demonstrated high internal validity as there was a baseline condition where his pre-manipulated behavior was established to show that he was not a fearful child. This means that there is a clear baseline to measure little Albert's behavior against. During the trials, there was a control condition, being the building blocks, to ensure that little Albert's fear extended exclusively to furry/animalistic objects. A motion picture camera was used to record the controlled observation to allow others to verify the integrity of Watson and Raynor's findings and to ascertain that his reactions were due to the stimuli and not due to other sources. So, ethical implications. There was an apparent lack of informed, valid consent. This is because consent for little Albert's participation was vicariously obtained, as it was obtained through his mother. Therefore, he did not specifically consent. This was impossible due to his age, but that does not mean that this fact can be ignored. Not only this, but the mother was not fully informed of the procedures of the experiment, hence why she immediately withdrew little Albert from the controlled observation once she learned of the true nature of the study. Therefore, the mother also did not give her informed, valid consent. Following from this, there was an apparent deception to the mother. For instance, she was unaware of the true nature of the observation as to the harm that little Albert would succumb to. So it all links, but for different points of ethical issues. Watson and Raynor did not protect little Albert from physical/psychological harm. This is demonstrated as they directly caused and allow him to suffer violent fear shown by his reactions. This was so potent that he developed a coping mechanism for fear, being sucking his thumb. He was also shown to fall over, which may have resulted in minor bruising. Nevertheless, the most harm was caused by psychological harm. While this may not be entirely scientifically valid, but it's a strong thesis anyway. If we consider crying as a child as crying to your mother so your mother can protect you because you were trying to communicate to your mother that something is wrong. Little Albert cried on multiple occasions, and yet his mother was absent. So this means that little Albert may have suffered greater psychological harm, as he was possibly crying for his mother, such using crying as a coping mechanism again for fear. If he was crying for his mother and his mother was not there, and yet he was subject to more harmful stimuli that elicited more fearful reactions, then this may have heightened the displeasure he was feeling. So he cried on multiple occasions, turned around to crawl away, and whimpered on several occasions, showing the apparent psychological distress/harm. While Watson and Raynor offered counter-conditioning to reverse the harm caused, this was denied. Therefore, in accordance with their conclusions, unless accidentally reversed, little Albert would have lived with those prominent fears permanently. This may suggest that they were aware that they were creating fear, considering they additionally stated, in order to not disturb the child too seriously, no further tests were given for 1 week. So this is the quote that I was referring to earlier. One of the only ethical advantages of the observation was that Watson and Raynor upheld the mother's right to withdraw from the observation. Once she learned of the true nature of it, she immediately withdrew little Albert and refused further advances. This was respected. Furthermore, there was a respect of privacy for little Albert/the mother. Inappropriately personal information was not requested of either. Watson and Raine did not pry for information unrelated to the experiment. Not only this, but Watson and Raine ensured that confidentiality was upheld. This is best demonstrated by the pseudonym given to Douglas Merritt, being Little Albert. Moreover, the mother is not referred to by name in the original article. If she's even though I've read it, if she's somewhere somehow is, then obviously this piece of information is incorrect. But I'm almost absolutely certain she's not. This protects their identities and is therefore an ethical advantage. The most prevalent and consequential social implications of the Watson and Raine study is its involvement in the development of systematic desensitization, so studied by Wolpe, or developed by Wolpe. This is because the observation allowed psychologists to understand the mechanics of phobias, allowing for the reversal of it. Watson and Raine already suggested a way to reverse phobias, dubbing it reconditioning in their notes. The development of systematic desensitization may benefit the economy as it allows for more functioning adults in the workplace. This especially applies to environments where they ordinarily would be incompatible with due to phobia. So, other social implications. This study has allowed psychologists to establish the links between human behavioral acquisition and animal behavioral acquisition by linking this study to Pavlov's dogs. This is a positive social implication as it has advanced scientific understanding of the human brain, so learning of a complex scientific concept being learning again. Knowing that humans, like animals, also learn through classical conditioning has allowed preventative measures against misbehavior to be implemented in schools. Now that classical conditioning is a proven method for behavioral acquisition, methods such as Robinson's token economy for neurodivergent children can be used to allow those with learning difficulties or neurodivergence to successfully integrate into typically functioning society. This is advantageous as it may result in a stronger economy due to more functional workers once they leave formal education. Studies such as McAllister et al. Demonstrate the effectiveness of classical conditioning in schools as children learn to associate appropriate behavior with praise and vice versa. Furthermore, positive social implications from this experiment are reaped in the home. In contemporary society, parents often use conditioning techniques to shape the behavior of their children. Placing a definitive method for teaching children appropriate behaviors allows parents to have clarity as to parental methods, which would allow for a more functional home and the development of a societally functional child/children. This is advantageous as it additionally steers society away from corporal physical punishment. Admittedly, this is also classed as conditioning. However, alternative, more effective, non-violent ways of conditioning children can be developed, such as the existence of the naughty step. So, cognitive classic research, Loftus and Palmer for AO1. The methodology was opportunity sampling, because they were all university students. At the University of Washington, there were 2 laboratory experiments. For experiment 1, there were 45 participants that were split into 5 groups, so there were 5 experimental conditions. In experiment 2, there were 150 participants split into 3 groups. There was an independent measures experimental design. So procedures. In experiment 1, 45 American university students were split into 5 groups of 9 people. They were shown 7 short clips ranging from 5 to 30 seconds long of a series of car crashes. They then answered a questionnaire showing a series of questions and the critical question of how fast were the cars going when they each other, which featured an interchangeable verb ranging from smashed, collided, bumped, contacted and hit. Experiment 2. 150 American university students split into 3 groups of 50, with one group being a control group. They were shown a short film that showed a car crash. Each group was asked a series of questions, including the critical question of how fast the cars were going when they either smashed, bumped, or hit each other. So Loftus and Palmer allocated each verb to a singular group. 1 week later, they were recalled and asked if they saw any broken glass after a series of questions, but there was no broken glass. So findings. In experiment 1, they found that a singular verb was able to change the answers of the participants. Therefore, leading questions can distort memory. However, that's kind of the latter part of that sentence is more like a conclusion, but you can include it anyway. So with the smashed condition, people on average, the participants, predicted that the cars were moving at a speed of 40.8. In the collided condition, 39.3. In the bumped condition, 38.1. In the contacted condition, 34.0. In the hit condition, 31.8. So in experiment 2, they found the results of, with those who were given the smash condition, so when Loftus and Palmer asked them how fast were the cars going when they smashed into each other, 16 people voted yes to there being broken glass. However, 34 people voted no. With people in the hit condition, 7 of them said yes, 43 said no. In the control condition, 6 said yes, 44 said no. So this suggests that not necessarily, so they found that, so Loftus and Palmer found that those who were given the verb smashed were more than twice as likely to state that there was broken glass, despite the absence of it anyway, compared to the hit group and the control group. So conclusions for experiment 1 found that memory can be altered because of the manipulation of a question. A singular verb was enough to alter somebody's recollection of events. However, 2 explanations to this were proposed. There was response bias present, which was influenced by the verb chosen. For instance, if a participant was unsure whether to choose between 30 or 40 miles per hour, the verb smashed may bias them towards choosing 40 miles per hour. On the other hand, genuine memory distortion may be present. Conclusions from experiment 2 state and support this, contradicting the conclusions of experiment 1. The verb used may have genuinely altered the perception, therefore recollection, of the participant's memory. This would cause them to remember the car crash as less or more serious depending on the verb used. So AO3 for the methodology. One disadvantage is that participants are all university students. Therefore, there is a high risk of participants conforming to demand characteristics, especially since deception was not used as to the aims of the study. Ordinarily, having a large sample size is an advantage, and it certainly is in this experiment. However, there's a lack of external validity because it only represents a small stratum of the general population, being American university students. This means that it is unrepresentative of the rest of the population, whether national or global, since it cannot be generalized to them. There is also the counter-argument to this though, that generally speaking, universities try and mimic the proportions, diversity-wise, to the rest of society. So if you look at Cambridge and Oxford University, they try to aim for roughly 2 to 3% of their students being black, or as many as they can. Obviously, it's not a primary aim, but just so that it reflects ordinary British society. So you might be able to argue that actually having a pool within university students, as long as it is a diverse pool, is representative of the population. But that's a side thought. It's just a side note, really. A lack of ecological validity can be seen as a short clip of a car crash does not mimic the traumatic nature of a real-life car crash, which may result in a higher degree of memory recollection. This is seen in the study conducted by Ewell and Cutshall. However, some may suggest that Loftus and Palmer's research into memory reconstruction is methodologically sound. The study has high levels of control as procedures are standardized across all participants, such as the questions asked in the questionnaires in experiment 1 being the same. This means that research is easily replicable, allowing for other research in similar fashion to conduct a similar experiment to verify the credibility of the conclusions. Also, all of the questions in the questionnaires, except for the critical one, were all filler questions as well. So this increases the reliability of the study as well, because again, people can repeat it because They are just filler questions that don't necessarily mean anything as to the critical question, as long as the questions do not possibly act as a confounding variable as to the findings such dependent variable. So ethical implications. The ethics of Loftus and Palmer study may be praised. It has a reduced risk of psychological distress beyond a temporary heightened level of stress at the climax of the video clips. Furthermore, there is no deception, which means that there is valid, informed consent for the participants to partake in the study. However, participants may still suffer minor psychological distress from witnessing crashes, as some reported crashes to occur at 39 plus miles per hour, which are still high speeds for a crash. Confidentiality of participants beyond their location at the time of the study, being Washington University, was respected. Following this, no invasive queries were asked, as aside from the critical question. All other questions were filler questions. So social implications. Loftus and Palmer's study may be praised for its positive social implications, and these are massive. It has allowed for advancements in the judicial system, calling to light the effect that leading questions can have on memory recollection. This has led to leading questions being unable to be used, so prohibited when examining in chief. This may not apply in American law, law practicing. However, in court, I know that barristers, so lawyers, can object based on having a leading question. So if you followed the Johnny Depp and Amber Heard case, a lot of the objections would have said like hearsay or leading questions or something like that. So acknowledging the large probability for acute failure in eyewitness testimonies would inevitably bring more justice due to the demand of physical evidence to prove criminal cases beyond reasonable doubt. So the standard of proof when proving a criminal case to a jury or a judge, such as magistrates, is beyond reasonable doubt. For tort law, so things like negligence or suing people, it's on a balance of probabilities, so 49 to 51% chance. Conversely, this may disadvantage victims of crimes that are generally difficult to prove without physical evidence, such as rape, domestic abuse, emotional abuse, assault, and other violent crimes or psychologically manipulative crimes. This is because it will generally only be the victim who will be able to give a testimony against the accused, so it may cause more injustice. So for instance, if a woman is spiked with medication that, generally speaking, will be excreted from the body within the next morning / the next day, it will be extremely difficult. Even if she knew who did it, it would be extremely difficult without CCTV or multiple eyewitness that all tell the exact same story to prove beyond reasonable doubt that he was guilty of delivering noxious substances or something along those lines. So if a lawyer / barrister cannot prove that beyond reasonable doubt, she will lose the case, or they will lose the case, which is obviously injustice as they were a victim. So Loftus and Palmer's study has additionally aided in the understanding of psychological pathology. Phenomena such as false memory syndrome, so seen by experiment 2, can now be understood by therapists and psychologists. Therefore, more effective treatment plans can be implemented. So the aims of Myers and Diener's classic research, so the positive approach. So the positive approach aims to be scientific and empirical. So this just means evidence-based. The aim of this study is to look at what makes people happy, which is very difficult. The aim of the study is to look at what makes people happy. This is very difficult, contrasting from the other approaches, as these tend to focus on what causes negative emotions / states of mind. So the methodology. The method used is a literature review. It is a review of existing research, meaning findings from the study is secondary data. Myers and Diener did not conduct first-hand research themselves, instead they reviewed multiple pieces of research carried out on happiness and well-being over the 1980s and the 1990s. So the process, the literature review process, released by Mackey and McEnvoy in their piece, The Literature Review in 2009. So number 1, select a topic. Number 2, search the literature. Number 3, develop your argument. Number 4, survey the literature. Number 5, critique the literature. Number 6, write the review. So for the procedures, Myers and Diener reviews research on happiness and well-being conducted over the 1980s and the 1990s, including self-reporting techniques such as subjective well-being tests, multi-item and Likert scales, meaning data can be quantified, observations, so participants would report what they are doing or thinking at a particular moment. This could be prompted by a message or time indicated by the researcher. Need a close bracket there. Correlations. So subjective well-being has been correlated with a lot of covariables to investigate whether certain factors affect happiness. They also did meta-analyses. So these just is a review which reviews multiple studies and their results. Findings. There is no real difference between happiness and age. A study of 170,000 people from 40 different countries found no relative difference between happiness and age. However, indicators change across ages. So this is shown by Engelhardt in 1990. There is generally no difference with happiness and gender. However, women are 2 times more likely than men to develop depression and anxiety. However, men are 5 more times likely to develop anti-personality disorder and alcoholism. So this is shown by Robinson and Rager. There is no real difference with happiness and age. Across participants with different nationalities, Crocker and Major, there is a large difference found with happiness and culture, however, as 10% of participants from Portugal stated that they were very happy. However, 40% of participants from the Netherlands stated that they were very happy. The traits of a happy person are defined as having self-esteem, a sense of personal control, extroversion, and optimism. Happy people are seen to have more friends than others, but those who can name 7 friends are happier than others. Lee et al. Came to the conclusion that married people are happier than others. This means that those who can name more intimate friends are less likely to die prematurely and are happier than those who have few or no friends. Those who produce more work and experience, therefore experience more work satisfaction due to flow states. So this is by Mihaly C. His last name is extremely long, so I think if you just put Mihaly C, you'll be alright. Money and happiness. Moderate positive correlations are found between this. Many adults believe that increased income would make them happier, so this is found by Strumpelt in 1976. So Gallup in 1984 stated that those with high spiritual commitments were twice as likely to say that they were very happy. Palmer and Pendleton, 1990. In North America and Europe, religious people reported higher levels of happiness. So values and goals. High subjective well-being has been associated with having ambitions and goals. Money and intelligence only matter if they are relevant to your goals. For the future, gender, culture, race, age, and affluence do not predict happiness. Happiness has been linked with people who have certain traits, close relationships, enjoy work, and are religious. Understanding happiness is important to enhance human well-being. Viable theory of happiness must acknowledge how important the role of adaptation is. Over time, the immediate emotional impact of life events lessens. One's cultural template additionally affects how they interpret life events, which may affect subjective well-being. Having non-conflicting goals and making ample progress in all of them is a sign of subjective well-being. Knowing a person's sex, age, race, and income is not a steady indicator of subjective well-being. Instead, knowing their traits is more of an accurate indicator of subjective well-being if they have a large network of friends, whether the person's culture allows for a positive daily interpretation of events, whether the person is engaged in work or leisure, and whether the person is in and participates in a faith that entails positive social support, purpose, and hope. This new research on psychological well-being is a welcome complement to previous studies on depression and anxiety, as well as studies conducted on psychological well-being previously. By asking who is happy, we can urge people to rethink their priorities to build a world that enhances well-being. So AO3 for Myers and Diener's methodology. There is an increased potential for researcher bias. The research that is included may have been chosen because they support the theories of Myers and Diener. The consequence of researcher bias means that an apparent strong correlation or relative truth does not reflect reality. This is a disadvantage as it may have negative social implications. It being a secondary piece of research means that it only finds correlational results rather than causal, meaning it is not scientific. Participants may lie about their subjective well-being, which is more likely in the structured interviews compared to the questionnaire. Participants may subject to social desirability bias to appear happier than they are. Fixed choice responses in structured interviews causes internal validity issues because participants may be forced to select a response they do not want to give, and therefore this may not be entirely accurate. There may be additional validity issues. Fixed choice responses can tell us who is happy, but not why. Moreover, people may have very little insight into their own happiness for a multitude of reasons. Ethical advantages. You could argue that it is ethical. While there is no direct informed consent to be part of Myers and Diener's literature review, there is implied consent due to the participants consenting to participate in the primary research. Moreover, there is substantially lower risk of psychological harm to participants beyond the use of socially sensitive data, which is a possible disadvantage, and self-report data. They may not want to question their own happiness. However, the right to withdraw at any time was upheld, which means that this was unlikely. Present confidentiality of individual participants is upheld, as there is not a risk of being exposed or identities being found at all, which means it is therefore ethical. So, ethical disadvantage of Myers and Diener's research. Where participants are concerned, generally speaking, the study of happiness, especially for subjective well-being, is a socially sensitive subject. Therefore, there is an acute risk for psychological harm due to the use of self-report data. People may not want to question their own happiness. Due to its nature as secondary data as a literature review, there is no informed consent for those who conducted or participated in the primary research. The researchers were not permitted to offer help if problems arose due to the answers given, but they could direct participants on where to find help. The beeper used in the observations may additionally be seen as intrusive, which may raise issues with privacy. So, social implications. On the one hand, establishing varying correlations between certain traits and/or activities as to well-being allows us to establish primary activities or traits that contribute majorly to happiness. This allows therapists, for instance, to confidently advise patients on how to improve subjective well-being. This aligns with the positive approach's assumption, authenticity of goodness and excellence, bringing patients from 0 to plus n. You'll see that change from free will. I realized that was incorrect. Not necessarily incorrect, but less accurate. So on the other hand, results and conclusions may be tainted due to the presence of beta bias. Assuming that subjective well-being is interpreted or assessed in the same way across different cultures is inherently flawed, unless if there was somebody fluent in both languages/cultures, and the results are immediately biased. Collectivist cultures may express happiness in alternative ways. This may frame the US and Europe as happier countries, which may contribute to the stigmatization of other countries through functions such as ethnocentrism. So, another disadvantage is that it's correlational research. So, correlation is not equivalent to causation. Therefore, we cannot establish whether it is these traits that make people happy or whether being happy that result in these traits. This is because cause and effect cannot be established. Validity issues concerning the artificiality of the task are present. This is because people may feel forced to state a feeling because that is what they are required to do. This, however, may be more accurate, as people do tend to ignore the individual components to the creation of happiness, which may be a more ecologically valid measure of subjective well-being. A major advantage is that the sample is extremely vast and plentiful in various ethnicities and countries. This means that it is ecologically and therefore externally valid, as it is representative. This is an advantage, as from the findings and conclusions we can make generalizations about happiness. However, this may be relative to Western countries, so for example Europe and the US, as our societies are fundamentally different to Eastern countries, which are often collectivist.